Iran Daily Briefing. Saturday, March 28, 2026. An Iranian missile struck a United States airbase in Saudi Arabia overnight, wounding several American service members and damaging aircraft. That strike comes as Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov met with Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araqchi on Friday to discuss the possibility of a diplomatic settlement, a conversation we'll examine more closely once you have the full context. The military strike and the diplomatic contact are happening simultaneously, and understanding how those two tracks relate to each other is the story of this Saturday morning. We are now 1 month into what has become the most significant direct military confrontation between the United States and Iran in modern history. It began on February 28th when the US and Israel launched coordinated strikes on Iran. Since then, the conflict has drawn in actors from Yemen to Lebanon to the Indian Ocean. Iran has moved to restrict or close the Strait of Hormuz, a waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply normally passes. Kuwaiti crude oil rose above $118 per barrel this week, a jump of more than $8 as energy markets price in sustained disruption. The civilian toll inside Iran is severe. The Iranian Red Crescent reports more than 92,600 civilian units damaged in US-Israeli strikes. A separate strike killed at least 168 people, the majority of them children, prompting the UN's human rights chief to call it a source of, in his words, visceral horror. Today's episode covers 3 separate tracks. The military track. An Iranian missile strike on a US airbase in Saudi Arabia, Iranian attacks on a logistics vessel near Oman, and an attempted strike on the joint UK-US base at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean. The diplomatic track, Lavrov and Araqchi meeting, Secretary Rubio at the G7 in Paris, and Trump making public statements about Iran at 2 separate events. And the regional track, Lebanon's Prime Minister speaking candidly about how his country entered this war, and Houthi forces in Yemen launching their first attack on Israel since the conflict began. Let's start with the missile strike. An Iranian ballistic missile struck a US military installation in Saudi Arabia at some point in the past 48 hours. NPR reports that several American service members were wounded. A US official, speaking to NPR, confirmed that some aircraft were also damaged in the strike. The base's location, inside Saudi Arabia, is significant. It means Iran has now struck directly at US forces operating from the territory of a country that is not formally a party to the conflict. Saudi Arabia has been hosting American military assets while simultaneously hosting diplomatic forums that include both US officials and regional leaders trying to manage the crisis. Striking a base on Saudi soil raises the stakes not just for Washington, but for Riyadh. From Washington's perspective, this is an attack on uniformed American personnel. NPR and a US official have reported the injuries and the aircraft damage. The political pressure on the White House to respond will be significant. From Tehran's perspective, the strike can be read in at least 2 ways. Iran may be demonstrating that it can reach American forces wherever they are positioned in the region, not just in Iraq or Syria, where the US and Iran have clashed before, but in the Arabian Peninsula itself. Or the strike may be a signal about leverage at the negotiating table. Iran's response, at least on the ground, has included continued military action even as diplomatic contacts accelerate. Whether those 2 tracks are coordinated Iranian strategy or the result of different factions pulling in different directions inside Tehran is not established by what we know today. Here's the diplomatic context. On the same day as the missile strike, Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov met with Iranian Foreign Minister Araqchi, according to Al Monitor, to discuss the possibility of a settlement. That meeting happened. Separately, President Trump, speaking at a Saudi investment conference, said the Middle East will soon be free from Iranian nuclear blackmail, language that suggests Washington is not, at least publicly, offering Iran a face-saving diplomatic exit. At a separate appearance in Miami, Trump called out Saudi official Yasser al-Rumayyan by name, urging him to encourage Saudi Arabia's entry into the Abraham Accords. That is a separate event from the investment conference, and it signals that Trump is simultaneously conducting military pressure, economic signaling, and diplomatic realignment in the Gulf, not necessarily in coordination. President Trump also claimed publicly that Tehran is seeking a deal. That claim is unverified beyond Trump's own statement. Iran has not confirmed it. Al-Monitor's reporting on the Lavrov-Araqchi meeting suggests that Russia is playing an intermediary role, which is consistent with prior Russian behavior in US-Iran standoffs. There is also the humanitarian dimension. The UN Human Rights Chief, Volker Turk, called on the United States this week to conclude its investigation into a strike on an Iranian school. A separate strike killed at least 168 people, the majority children, according to BBC reporting. Turk described the scene as evoking visceral horror. The Iranian Red Crescent says more than 92,600 civilian units have been damaged across the country in US-Israeli strikes since February 28th. These numbers, sourced to Iranian institutions, cannot be independently verified, but they are being cited at the UN level and are part of the international pressure environment the United States is operating within. Former Israeli Health Minister Nitzan Horowitz, who served from 2021 to 2022, made a notable public statement this week. He said that regime change in Iran and the dismantling of Iran's military capabilities are not achievable through airstrikes. That assessment from a former Israeli cabinet member reflects a debate that is clearly happening inside Israeli political circles, even if it is not the official Israeli government position. What to watch? Whether Saudi Arabia makes any public statement about the missile strike on its soil. Riyadh's response, or silence, will tell us a great deal about how the Saudis are calibrating their position between Washington and Tehran. Story 1. The Houthi entry into the conflict. Yemen's Houthi movement confirmed on Saturday, March 28th, that it launched an attack on Israel, its first since the current war against Iran began. Al Jazeera reports the Houthis fired a barrage of ballistic missiles targeting what they described as sensitive Israeli military sites in southern Israel. France 24 also confirmed the claim. The Houthis are based in western Yemen, hundreds of kilometers to the south of Israel. Launching ballistic missiles over that distance requires significant capability, and the Houthis have demonstrated that capability before. Whether these missiles were intercepted, caused damage, or both is not confirmed in today's sourcing. The significance here is the timing. The Houthis have been closely aligned with Iran throughout the Gaza conflict and the broader regional confrontation. Their decision to open a new front against Israel, specifically timed to coincide with the war on Iran, is consistent with the broader pattern of Iran's allied networks activating when Iran itself is under pressure. The Houthis, Hezbollah, and Iraqi militia groups have all historically operated as what analysts call Iran's axis of resistance, a network of non-state actors who share Iranian strategic interests but operate with varying degrees of independence. What to watch? Whether Israel responds to the Houthi missile launch and whether the Houthis follow with additional salvos. A sustained Houthi campaign against Israel would stretch Israeli air defenses and add a new operational dimension to a conflict that is already multi-front. Story 2. Lebanon's Prime Minister speaks. Lebanese Prime Minister Nawaf Salam gave a notable interview to France 24 this week, conducted in Beirut. His remarks are worth examining carefully. Salam said, in his words, "This war was imposed upon us." He also said Lebanon could have avoided the war had Hezbollah not fired rockets in retaliation for what he described as the US-Israeli assassination of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. That is a significant statement from a sitting head of government. Salam is essentially saying two things simultaneously: that Lebanon did not choose this war and that Hezbollah's actions, not Israeli or American ones, were the immediate trigger for Lebanon's involvement. This puts him in direct tension with Hezbollah, which remains a powerful political and military force inside Lebanon. The statement reflects the fractured nature of Lebanese governance. The Lebanese state and Hezbollah have coexisted uneasily for decades, with Hezbollah operating its own military command structure largely independent of the Lebanese armed forces. Salam's public distancing from Hezbollah's decision to fire rockets is politically consequential. It signals that the Lebanese government may be trying to establish its own lane in whatever post-conflict negotiations eventually occur. What to watch? Hezbollah's response to Salam's comments and whether his public framing creates political pressure on Hezbollah inside Lebanon. Story 3. Zelensky, Saudi Arabia and the Iran connection. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky made a public statement this week that Saudi Arabia faces the same type of attacks from Iran that Kyiv has been resisting. BBC reporting confirms the statement. Zelensky's remark is a deliberate diplomatic move. Ukraine has been on the receiving end of Iranian-supplied Shahed drones since at least 2022. And Kyiv has consistently argued that Iranian weapons exports are not a regional problem, they are a global one. By drawing a direct line between Iranian attacks on Saudi Arabia and Iranian-supplied attacks on Ukraine, Zelensky is trying to insert Ukraine into the diplomatic conversation happening in Riyadh and Washington. Whether this resonates in Riyadh is unclear. Saudi Arabia has maintained complex relationships with both Russia and Ukraine throughout the Ukraine war, including hosting peace process talks. Zelensky positioning himself as a natural ally of the Gulf states against Iranian military aggression is a calculated reframing, one that may find a more receptive audience now than it would have 2 months ago. What to watch? Whether any Gulf state formally acknowledges Zelensky's framing, and whether Ukraine is included in any multilateral conversations about the Iran war. Story 4. Abu Dhabi, debris and the regional blast radius. 5 Indian nationals were injured in Abu Dhabi this week when debris from intercepted ballistic missiles fell on the city, according to the Abu Dhabi Government Media Office. Middle East Eye reports the incident. The detail worth noting, these were interceptions. The missiles were shot down, but the debris from those intercepts still caused injuries on the ground. This is a known problem with high-altitude missile defense in populated areas. The intercept itself is not always clean. Abu Dhabi is not a party to this conflict. The United Arab Emirates has been careful to maintain diplomatic distance from both sides, but missiles and missile debris do not respect those distinctions. Indian nationals being injured in Abu Dhabi from Iranian missile debris will register in New Delhi, which has its own complex relationships with both Tehran and Washington. What to watch? Whether the Indian government makes a formal statement and how Abu Dhabi characterizes the incident in its own official communications. In the cold open, we flagged 2 things happening simultaneously: the Russian-Iranian diplomatic contact and the Iranian missile strike on the US base in Saudi Arabia. Now that you have the fuller picture, here is what that combination actually looks like. In the same 48-hour window as President Trump's extension of the deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, Iran also struck a US airbase in Saudi Arabia, targeted a US logistics vessel near the Omani port of Salalah, according to Iran's military command, and conducted an attempted strike on the joint UK-US base at Diego Garcia in the Indian Ocean, approximately 4,000 kilometers from Iranian territory, according to Iran International. Iran also notified the International Atomic Energy Agency that Israel had struck a heavy water production plant at Kondab, while confirming there was no radiation risk because the facility contained no nuclear material. That is a significant volume of military activity across a wide geographic range. What the intel does not tell us is whether these actions are coordinated responses to the deadline extension or whether they reflect separate decision chains inside the Iranian military and political structure. We also know that Lavrov and Araqchi met on Friday to discuss a possible settlement. The factual pattern is Iran is conducting strikes across multiple theaters while simultaneously engaging in diplomatic contact through Russian channels. What that combination means about Iranian strategy is genuinely contested, and we won't overstate what the sourcing supports. What it does mean, concretely, is that any negotiation, if one is underway, is happening while both sides are still actively exchanging fire. Several things to watch closely in the next 24 to 48 hours. The US response to the airbase strike. NPR and a US official have reported American casualties and aircraft damage. The White House has not yet announced a formal military response. Watch for any Pentagon briefing or presidential statement that signals whether the US treats this as requiring a direct counterstrike or as part of the ongoing campaign already underway. Saudi Arabia's public posture. Riyadh has hosted both American forces and diplomatic forums throughout this conflict. An Iranian missile landing on a US base inside Saudi territory puts the kingdom in a delicate position. A Saudi government statement, or the absence of one, will be telling. The G7 foreign ministers in Paris. Secretary of State Rubio met with G7 counterparts on Friday. The communiqué or readout from that meeting, when it comes, will show whether the US and its European allies are aligned on the diplomatic track, the military track, or neither. G7 foreign minister statements tend to be diplomatically hedged, but watch for language on Iran's nuclear program specifically. That will indicate how much pressure Europe is willing to apply. The Strait of Hormuz deadline. Trump extended the deadline for Iran to reopen the strait. No public end date for that extension has been confirmed in today's sourcing, but energy markets are already reacting. Kuwaiti crude above 118 tons per barrel reflects how seriously traders are pricing the closure risk. When the deadline extension expires, or if Iran makes any move on the strait, that will be an immediate market-moving event. The IAEA and Kondab. Iran has notified the International Atomic Energy Agency about the Israeli strike on the heavy water plant at Kondab. The IAEA will be expected to send inspectors or issue a formal assessment. Iran's statement that there was no radiation risk is unverified by an independent body. Watch for the agency's response. The Houthi missile campaign. Saturday's launch was described by the Houthis as their first against Israel in the current conflict. Whether it is also the last or the opening salvo of a sustained campaign will become clearer in the next day or two. Israeli air defense and any Israeli response will determine the trajectory. Bahrain. Al Jazeera reports that a 32-year-old man arrested in Bahrain for opposing the war on Iran died in police custody, according to rights groups. Bahrain is a small island nation that hosts the US Navy's Fifth Fleet, strategically central to everything happening in the Gulf right now. Domestic unrest in Bahrain, even if contained, is a variable worth tracking. Today's episode matters because the gap between the diplomatic track and the military track is the central tension of this conflict right now. And understanding that gap is the difference between reading the headlines and understanding what is actually happening. Tomorrow's briefing will follow the Saudi response to the airbase strike, any development from the G7 in Paris, and the Houthi situation in Israel. We'll be here. If you found today's briefing valuable, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. New episodes every morning.